This is Booked on Rock. I'm Eric Senich. Our guests this episode, Dave Lewis and Mike Tremaglio, authors of Evenings with Led Zeppelin, the complete concert chronicle. From their earliest gig in a Denmark school gymnasium on September 7th, 1968, through to the last gig that Jimmy Page, Robert Plant, and John Paul Jones ever performed with John Bonham in Berlin on July 7th, 1980, this is the Led Zeppelin story told from where the legend was forged, live on stage. Deploying impeccable research spread over many years, Dave Lewis and Mike Tremaglio bring clarity, authority, and perspective to the band's unique story. Evenings with Led Zeppelin, the complete concert chronicle, was released originally in December of 2018. On September 23rd, a brand new revised and expanded edition will be released through Omnibus Press. Dave Lewis first heard the music of Led Zeppelin in 1969 at the age of 13. The effect has been a lasting one. He's acknowledged and respected throughout the world as a leading chronicler of the group and its individual members. Dave is the editor and founder of the acclaimed Led Zeppelin magazine Tight But Loose. Established in 1978, it reaches out to Led Zeppelin fans in over 20 countries across the world. In 2015, Dave contributed the liner notes to the official Led Zeppelin release, The Complete BBC Sessions. He's been lucky enough to attend 15 Led Zeppelin concerts. He's attended various Jimmy Page and John Paul Jones gigs and has witnessed Robert Plant perform live on over 100 occasions. Mike Tremaglio is one of the foremost Led Zeppelin researchers and has chronicled their work over many years in print and on the web. For many years, he wrote popular tour retrospectives for the highly regarded Tight But Loose magazine. He's also contributed significantly to several of co-author Dave Lewis's books and magazine features. To hear the music discussed in this episode, check out the show notes page. Dave and Mike, thank you for being on the podcast. Great to talk to you guys.
Hi, pleasure. How are you doing?
So before we talk about the book, I am interested in your backstories regarding Led Zeppelin. Dave, in the book it says you first heard the music of Zeppelin in 1969 at the age of 13. The effect was lasting. Talk about that moment. Was it a song on the radio? Was it a concert?
It was very lasting. It was a whole lot of love. It was on the radio. It was on what we have in England, or did at the time, was a weekly show that counted down the charts, and I would listen intently every week because I was a massive music fan, and I like the Beatles, the Stones, the Hollies, all the groups of the day. And Alan Freeman, who would later go on to introduce Led Zeppelin at Earl's Court, who was a big supporter of the band from the really early days, he began to play album tracks as well as the singles, because Led Zeppelin didn't release singles in the UK, they did in the US. So on this particular day, I was waiting to find out if Ho Well by Fleetwood Mac was going to beat He Ain't Heavy, He's My Brother by the Hollies to the number one spot. Before that, Alan Freeman played a track from a new album called Led Zeppelin 2, and it was Led Zeppelin, it was a whole lot of love, and it was like nothing I'd ever heard. It was just extraordinary. It wasn't the Hollies, it wasn't Fleetwood Mac, it was something out there, and I needed to know much, much more about this band. So that's how it began, and I began to research and find out as much as I could about them. I read all the weekly music press. I got to hear Led Zeppelin 2. We used to have a record shop where you could go in and you could play on a booth they had. You could play track one of each side of the album. So I heard Whole Lot of Love, and on the other side I heard Heartbreaker, but at the time it was the only tracks I'd heard. Anyway, fast forward, during 1970, the tension and build up to Led Zeppelin 3 was just incredible, and I was enthralled by it. And then when the album came out in October, I was in love with it, and that set me off. The scrapbooks got more intensive, the following got more fervent. I got to see them play live in 1971 at the Empire Hall, Wembley, the famous Electric Magic Show. Things were never the same in our house after that, and it became a way of life. It became an obsession. It became a passion. And I wanted to share that passion. And eventually, Led Zeppelin didn't do fan clubs. So I created this magazine called Tight But Loose, after an expression that Jimmy and Robert had used to sort of explain their music. And it went from there. And here we are, some 50 years later. And still a passion. it's still a way of life, and I've been a very lucky man to be part of it. And many things have happened in between that. I've obviously met them many times. I've interviewed them. I've been part of their world. I've met extraordinary people like Mike who have shared this passion. And we were able to, 10 years ago, really, when we first had the idea, to share this passion into a book project that would be Evenings with Led Zeppelin. Now, I had already done some chronicling of the live Zep history. I'd done a book called The Concert File with a chap called Simon Pallet, very pre-internet. I could go back and I had an exercise book in 1977 of the first sort of workout of where Led Zeppelin played. And so I'd already had that passion. Now, I knew Mike had the same. So when we came on the same page, the end result is what we've got now, and it's been a pleasure, to work with him. I'm enthralled by Mike's research and have been, and he's the perfect man to have done this job, and I feel a privilege to have been part of it. So it's been a great journey.
Mike, your origin story with Led Zeppelin, Madison Square Garden, New York City, June 7th, 1977 is when you got to see them. When did you first hear the band's music?
Believe it or not, probably the first time I ever heard them was either their first or second album, because I had a babysitter, my older cousin. She was a passionate music fan. She had she used to bring over albums every week, and I remember for sure she had the second album, and it was Whole Lotta Love. I mean, that was the one that, just like Dave, that was the one that really hooked me too, because especially for a young kid, you hear a song like that, it really was a revelation. Then he had all the middle part where you had the panning of the speakers, and it was very unusual, and just the guitar riffs in the middle there, and the drum, and it really, that really started it to some degree, but really, where it really took off was when they released Houses of the Holy, because my brother, who was 4 years older than me, was a big fan of the band, and Houses of the Holy was a huge album in the United States. That really took off, and once that came out, then it really became a full-on passion. I remember, the day Physical Graffiti came out, we were waiting for the album in the record store, and then anytime they released anything else, we were there before the UPS guy was there delivering the album. So that's really my backstory. It really was Houses of the Holy. It really took it to another level. But then I tried to get tickets for the 75 shows, but wasn't lucky enough. That was a disappointment. But I was able to see him in 77 because a guy I went to gym class with brought in the New York Times from the day before, handed it to me, and the rest is history.
The book originally came out in 2018. So what led to you guys teaming up to work on this book about this specific area of the band, which is their concert history? How did you guys meet?
Well, it was through the Type Blues magazine, and Mike got in touch many years ago and said that he'd been working on these logs of the gigs. He'd obviously seen what I'd done with the concert file, and we began to insert them into the magazine, and they were so thorough. They were beyond anything I'd ever seen. The set list, the detail, the venues. Mike had got it nailed, and I was able to add my stuff as well. So it really began with the features that we ran in the Type Blues magazine regularly. And I think one of the first ones we did were the 69 festivals. And then we began to do year by year. And it was so evident that we needed a better platform for this stuff, because it needed to be in book format. So very early on, and at least 10 years ago, I said to Mark, we need to try and do something. So really that was a beginning. And I think, I beavered away to try and, get a deal where we could get this into book format. And I'd worked with Omnibus Press and a guy called Chris Charlesworth, who at the time was the editor-in-chief of the company. He's Backstories that he was a journalist for the Melody Maker. He had a massive association with Led Zeppelin. He met them many times, reviewed them. So, and I'd done previous books with him. So he was the perfect man to edit the book. And eventually, after a bit of toing and froing, he said, yes, we're going to go with this idea. And away we went. And then Mike beavered away, and we began to formulate what became the book. And again, it was over a number of years. I mean, it wasn't something that was going to be done in 6 months or And we didn't want to be rushed either. I'm sure Mike will tell that story as well. The detail had to be as accurate as possible. There had been previous books, mine included, that had the history, but this was a chance, an opportunity, maybe the only chance, to put the record straight. And again, so many things came out of what Mike's research had done, had brought from going to college archives and the stuff that I had. And once we put it in, it was evident pretty early on we got something special. So we had to nurture that. And that took a lot of time and a lot of detail, which I'm sure Mike can take up the story and tell.
Yes, in terms of just a backstory, Dave and I think we started collaborating in like 2005. I mean, it's been a long time. And, I always just, Dave has always done a great job at the Type It Loose and his website. So he really, Dave's a central figure in the Zeppelin community, so to speak. He always puts it out there, always has. And, we were really on the same page from the very, very beginning, which was key because we both had very strong ideas of what we really wanted to do. I never just wanted to do another Led Zeppelin book. There's plenty of Led Zeppelin books. We really wanted to do a comprehensive, Led Zeppelin live concert, encyclopedia, essentially. But the thing is, the goal was really not to only just track down all the dates and all the facts, figures, concerts, and all that, but really dig out the stuff that a lot of people weren't able to find. And whether it's through obscure underground newspaper library archives or whatever it was, we've managed to dig out a lot of material previously unknown. But it was just nice being able to collect it all in a volume that people could enjoy, because I think Zeppelin is one of those bands where their concert history and all the bootlegs, everything associated with it, there's a real passion and, obsession with it for a lot of people. The bootlegs, because there's so many bootlegs involved with Led Zeppelin, that only enhanced the whole thing. So, we really felt like we were doing a book that was really for all of us. And I don't mean just me and Dave, but literally anybody who has that kind of passion for Led Zeppelin concerts. And so that was the goal, was really to nail down every date, every concert, every set list, every bootleg, every little bit of information regarding all the concerts. But I also think it was important, too, that we communicated what everybody wrote about the concerts at the time, because that was important to us. We wanted to make sure that we didn't sugarcoat anything, because there are so many reviews where people tore them to shreds. I'm sure you've probably seen that just in looking through the book. It's like, wow, you can't believe how harsh some of these reviews were.
It's hard to imagine it now because Led Zeppelin is such a legendary band. But that's what I love about it, is to put things into perspective, what the critics thought of them then. And also, you see how the band is growing to this massive proportion. They're in these little clubs. And then there's that picture, I think it's in New Zealand, where the crowd is spilling over where the venue really is supposed to end. And it's people way out into the forests that are, they can't even see the stage. I don't even know how they can hear it, but they had to go see Led Zeppelin.
Again, something that became apparent as we were doing it was the momentum of the story. And it's a brilliant, brilliant story in rock history, because they worked so hard in the first year, to establish themselves. And it was Jimmy Page's band, but the chemistry of the band came through because of that. But if you read as you go on and you see how things build, it's not just the story of Led Zeppelin. It's a story of the rock business growing up in the 70s. It really is. And I think one of the things we've been asked about in previous interviews is, will this book appeal to people outside of Led Zeppelin? And it will, because it's rock history. It's not, all right, the subject matter is obviously Led Zeppelin, but the way, they played everywhere they could. And then suddenly they became through obviously Peter Grant, the manager, who was a maverick manager, they appeared with no support act. That had never happened. They were one act on a 56,000 gig in Tampa. And again, that night, which is May the 5th, 1973, was the night Led Zeppelin weren't just a rock band anymore. They were an institution, and it just went on from there. And I think, you look at the book and you go through the pages, and the momentum is fascinating. And then again, Mike's ability to dig out so much detail, and particularly visually, because the one thing we did want the book to be was a visual tour de force, and it is not only from Mike's idea to have as many pictures of the venues, because then you get historical perspective. You understand what type of place they were playing, from Pirates World, to Earl's Court. It's a fascinating growth, and I think that was something the book has got that I don't think I'm a collector of rock books. I love many other acts, but I don't think any book has done a concert history as detailed and to tell the story as well as it had. I think very early on we even thought about trying to include the studio albums and everything else, but it became apparent that to really concentrate, we needed to go from 1968 to 1980, and then obviously touch on some of the reunions and such like, and some of the pre-Zeppelin story. But it was that core of work that was done over 500 plus gigs that we wanted to center on, and it needed everything else stripped out. And I think that worked beautifully, because the focus is on the momentum of what Led Zeppelin achieved, which no other band had ever achieved before or since, really. And again, you also see the template for the modern touring world. I mean, all the bands that went on to do the mega gigs, the U2s, the Stones, the Metallicas, the template is Led Zeppelin. And if you read, any page of that book, you will see that. So I think the growth of the rock business and Led Zeppelin is all in there, and visually it's just unbelievable. What again, hats off to Mike, because he nurtured this stuff, and the adverts, the handbills, the concert tickets, it just brings it alive. It really does, for anybody. And yeah, we were lucky to be there. I was probably lucky more than most. I saw them 15 times. I was very fortunate. But anyone can get on this journey and on this ride and get the best from it. So that's what the book does.
It's interesting, the choice of the front cover photo, too, is from those days playing the small gigs. Where is that from?
Boston Tea Party. Yeah, Boston Tea Party in May 1969. In fact, if you look really closely, Eric, you'll see on the speaker, it says the word Zephyr, which was Tommy Bolin's band that were the support act that night.
Oh, cool. Zephyr. Wow. Tommy Bolin of, Deep Purple for a few minutes.
Deep Purple.
Yeah.
But yeah, he had his life ended way too soon, but yeah, legendary guitarist among the guitar community for sure. And I noticed I do see a familiar face in here, and I'm not imagining that's J.J. Jackson, right?
It sure is.
MTV.
Yeah, he was WBCN DJ at the time, Boston, and he was really close friends with the bands. He saw him in Boston in January and May '69. He even announced them at the Boston Garden the following year. 5 years later, he even announced them at the LA Forum. So they were very close friends with J.J. Jackson.
Original MTV VJ, J.J. Jackson. And how about there are females in that audience? This wasn't an all-guy band. This wasn't the typical heavy metal band where all the dudes are showing up. Look at the girls in the front row, and they're all you got one of them gazing at Robert.
Yeah, I think that was a part of the attraction, because Zeppelin was such a visual band. I think they were able to draw more of the young ladies to the shows than some of the other people, I think.
It's worth mentioning the ability for Led Zeppelin to attract an American audience as quickly as they did was very crucial in their success. And also, I think because they were English, if you go back to the British invasion, as they call it, in the 60s with the Beatles and the Stones and the Herman Hermits and Dave Clark Five, Zeppelin were the second wave of that. And, in America, there is a big attraction for English groups and singers, and they fitted that mold so well because they were exotic. They were mysterious. You had the front singer who was, a real front man in the real old school, but also had a bit of Jim Morrison, had a bit of Janis Joplin even. You had the genius guitarist. You had the drummer who drummed like no other drummer had done before or since. And John Paul Jones, who was the musician's musician. The chemistry of that band was so right. And there's very few other bands that have had that. And again, the ability to present that on stage on any given night, completely differently to the previous night, is the attraction of Led Zeppelin live. When we were coming up with a title, and we went to various things. But I remember Peter Grant, I was lucky enough to interview him, one of the last people to interview him in 1993. I went to his house, and he said to me, Led Zeppelin was an in-person band. The studio albums was just a starting block, as fantastic as they were. It was what they did night after night. And he remembered, you know, in England, we used to have a music hall thing where you would have Evening with Max Miller or any of these guys from the 30s and 40s. And he remembered that, and he was a showman with Peter Grant. So when he presented Led Zeppelin on the adverts as An Evening with Led Zeppelin, that's exactly what it was. It wasn't an evening with anyone else, mostly. And that title just rang so clear as a bell. And that's why we used it. And I think it says everything. And I think the picture as well, we didn't want a picture. There's so many Led Zeppelin books that have got Page and Plant in a classic mode. We wanted the chemistry of the band to shine through in the picture, and no more does it do so than in that amazing picture and the rapport with the audience. And again, the ability with Led Zeppelin was they could be playing to 1,000 people or 56,000 people, but the connection with the audience was exactly the same. But that shot in '69, I think it shows the growth. It shows what was about to happen. And I think it's so right for the book, and we were very pleased. We had to do some jiggery pokery with that picture to fit it all in, as Mike might take up the story.
What happened there, Eric, was, we love the picture. We absolutely love the picture. There was only one problem. John Paul Jones wasn't in the picture. There was a picture taken either the night before or the night after. We're not sure which. But the picture was of John Paul Jones, but the picture was taken from the same vantage point. Only this time John Paul Jones was in there. We certainly didn't want a picture of Led Zeppelin doing their thing live with having that connection with the audience and not have John Paul Jones in there. So we made sure we pulled the picture beside John Paul Jones is absolutely one picture, but John Paul Jones was taken from a different night to get him in the picture.
Wow.
So
would never have known that.
We took a bit of artistic license, but it all worked. And then, it was beautifully presented. And so we had the title, we had the cover. All we needed was the 600 plus pages to fill. But that's where we took another 4 years to get there.
That's what I want to ask. How many sources did you reach out to get all of these things? I know there's the great Led Zeppelin historian Brian Knapp, a big help on this as well. But how many altogether combined?
Oh, my God. I can't even begin to describe how many sources of information, people, you name it. I mean, Brian, of course, Brian is a legendary collector. His collection is literally, incomparable, literally. And Brian, in particular, this second edition, Brian really helped out a lot, because he jumped on board for the second edition. And just to give credit where credit is due, too, we had so many good people help us out the first time around as well. Guys like Cliff Hilliard, who has a brilliant ticket collection. We have Scott Baker, who also just has an incredible Led Zeppelin collection. And Sam Rapallo, who runs the official LedZeppelin.com, was a real great source of pictures and help, really helping us out a lot. But more than anything, it's really a question of digging in archives the old-fashioned way. I can't even begin to describe how many sources of information were used, especially because a lot of this stuff goes back a good 15 years. This is the end result. But between Dave and myself, we've been chronicling Led Zeppelin forever. So it's fun. You'll probably be familiar with this because Wesleyan is fairly close to us. But Wesleyan is one of the few universities in the country that had, at the time, the underground newspaper collection. It was a collection of 500 microfilm reels to go through, and it had all those underground newspapers, and you had to do it the old-fashioned way, put on the reels and go through it. A lot different than doing searches on archives online, but that was done 12, 15 years ago. So a lot of the material came from there. But as years went by, every day they put on new archives, whether it's new newspapers that came on board, underground newspapers, all that. But between all those sources and all the people that helped us out, this is the final result. I mean, when you look, even so much as Dave was talking about the venues, for me, the venue pictures were very, very important because it helped tell the whole story in terms of we wanted to give people an idea of what going to a Led Zeppelin concert was like. You have your ticket, you have your newspaper ad, you had you had the review the next day in the paper. So it really took you from the beginning to end of the whole concert experience. So having the venue photo, people could, just by looking in the book, they could see the place and envision themselves going in there and checking out the concert. So that's why it was so important to me to include the venue so people could get an idea of that. And that's why we did it.
It's worth mentioning, really, the timeline of what's happened since the first version came out. So we beavered away for 4 years, and the first version came out in September 2018, and Mike came over. We had a wonderful launch, in London, and it was fantastic. And away it went. The print run was quite low, and it quickly sold out. So Mike beavered away in 2018 and 2019, and more information. I mean, the beauty of the Led Zeppelin story, and maybe any band of that longevity, is that there's always something else to find out. And particularly in the last year or so, there's been so many different finds. There's been cine film that has come up. There's been more tapes that have emerged. So it was evident in 2019 and into 2020 that we had scope to do more. And we went to them, we went to Omnibus Press and said, we'd like to put the book out again, but we don't want a straight reprint. We want 48 more pages. Now, that's quite unheard of in publishing terms for a publisher to go back and update something as vast as what we had. But very pleasingly, they went with that. And again, Mike had beavered away, had logged so much more information. So we were able to go back. And in the last year, or 18 months probably, Mike and I have beavered away, and Mike has led that. And don't forget, we've done this in a time where of massive problems with the pandemic. My poor lady wife broke a leg, and we had to deal with that. And I know Mike had many personal issues. So to have got to where we've got has been a massive, achievement. And to get to where we did early in the year with so much more information, and every page we looked at again. So I think the point I'm trying to make is the book that you've got now is so much more than what we had in 2018. So in effect, we've made a good thing even better. And again, I can only say hats off to Mike for the way he just pushed it through to the finishing line. But we knew we had the basis of something that we could really build on. 2018's version was just the starting point. And here we are again with another achievement. Whether we can go on and do more, I don't know. I mean, the story does continue. But what we can say, and I know Mike has got a whole list of how much more is in this version than other. If anyone who bought the first version is in two minds to buy the new one, well, we've got a whole lot of stats, as it were, that will prove otherwise, because it's almost a new book.
Actually, that was a good segue to it's going to sound like a sales pitch, but if nothing else, this will give the audience a chance to understand why would you buy the second edition after the first edition. And just to give you some of the highlights, I mean, now there's over 300,000 words. There's 3,100 images. It's been extended by 48 pages. But not only that, too, 55 concert entries have been expanded in length. 55 concert entries include new press concert previews and reviews. You have 100 concert tickets added, many of them courtesy of my friend Brian Knapp. 75 concert advertisements, 25 concert photos, including some of my favorites at the local Oakdale, as you know, Eric. 20 handbills, 20 images, press releases. But not only that, too, we also have 11 new unconfirmed or canceled Led Zeppelin gigs to add to the story. So there really is quite a bit of information that's been added to the second book. So this isn't a question of hitting the reprint, not even close. The amount of time and effort that was put into expanding this was off the charts. But another key thing, too, at the very end of the book, I'm sure you've seen, we also added a 10-page concert bootleg CD discography that includes almost 2,000 bootlegs. And it's a quick guide. It's not meant to be a really extensive thing. It's just a chance to give everybody, okay, for each specific date, what are some of the key bootleg CD silver press titles that they can look at. So that pretty much sums up a lot of why second edition is required for people who really got into the first one, and for anybody who missed the first one and who's into Zeppelin. I can't imagine anyone not being pleased.
The Booked on Rock podcast will return after this.
This is probably the point to bring in the fact that obviously we also wanted to impress the members of the group. And I was able, with the first edition, to hand copies personally to Jimmy Page and John Paul Jones. And Robert Plant got one as well. And their reaction was fantastic. They were enthralled by it. I know particularly Jimmy, who's an archivist anyway, he's the keeper of the flame. He could see the integrity and the detail that's gone into it. And I'm sure they're going to be equally as, impressed with the new edition. I've always had a personal request from Robert, to make sure he gets one, and the same with Jimmy and John Paul Jones. And one of the things I said a couple of weeks ago was that this is a book that they could give their children or their grandchildren and say, this is what we achieved in those years as part of Led Zeppelin. And the fact that Mike and I have created that is a huge fulfillment. And I really passionately believe that is, something that they will feel very honoured by. And not only that, they know that the story has been told in the right way, because musically, our gig is music. It's not the sex and drugs and rock and roll. That's another part of the story, and part of it is very valid in terms of the history of the whole rock movement then. But, our thing is music. It's about the music. It's about the band. It's about them playing live on any given night. And we're particularly proud, I think, that you could say to the players who created it, this is what you achieved. And again, as many people have said to me, we know the story better than they do. And there's no doubt that this book presents it in such a fantastic way. So we're very proud of that.
Yeah, that's the ultimate stamp of approval when those guys give it the thumbs up.
I don't know if you can see, that's what John Paul Jones wrote when he signed something for me and Mike. It says, "To Dave, great work. I shall enjoy it." And John Paul Jones wrote that to me personally in a dressing room when he was doing a gig, and he wrote one for Mike. And Jimmy's book is, what have I got here? Jimmy's book is signed to me, and it says, 12 years gone, well done, Jimmy Page, because he wrote it 12 years after the O2 gig. I met him at a record fair. So, I've been very fortunate to have a great rapport with all of them over many years. But I know, and one of the things we wanted to achieve was a book that they would hold in highest esteem, possibly, I hope, better than any other book that's previously done on them. Because I think in terms of the music and the research and the presentation of it, it's just a brilliant, brilliant book. And if this was a book by whatever other band, the Stones, the Beatles, Bruce Springsteen, maybe anyone that's got a concert history, the band members would be able to say this is it. And I think it is, in terms of for Led Zeppelin fans and for the group themselves, and anyone interested in rock music during the 70s. It's just the perfect thing. It is the last word, and that's what we're so proud of.
One thing I thought was very gratifying for me was seeing a picture of Dave next to John Paul Jones holding the book. Dave posted a nice pic of John Paul holding the first Evenings with Led Zeppelin book, which was nice to see. I did, when I was over in London, I did talk to Richard Cole, which was great because Richard did our forward. And when you think about it, between him and Peter Grant, they saw more Zeppelin shows than anybody else beside the four members. So
Richard Cole, yes, the Led Zeppelin tour manager.
Yeah, legendary Richard Cole, and it was nice to talk to him. He's been a big advocate for the book. He wrote the foreword, did a very nice job, and it's just good knowing that the band appreciate what we did, because I think if people understood how much work went into it, and I mean it's really gratifying to see it. It's been so well received. 95+% 5-star rating on Amazon, which is great. But more than anything, just knowing that the people who have the same passion for Zeppelin as we do enjoy it just as much, because this book is for them.
There's something I must add is, I might be a bit more sort of high profile in some of the stuff, and I've written obviously previous books, but I can tell you that all the band members are aware of the research quality that Mike has brought to this project. And not only that, Mike was also used for the official Led Zeppelin releases that came out, the reissues. So they are more than aware of what Mike has achieved and what he does. And I tell you something else that's very good about this book and about the relationship we've got them is the element of trust between the band and us, because I think that's very high. And I think they already knew my work, and obviously now with Mike's, that we will do them proud. And I think to have someone like Richard Cole on board, who was the tour manager of Led Zeppelin, who picks and chooses who he wants to speak to have him was such a compliment. The fact that he trusted us to use his words in the right way to project the story of Led Zeppelin for him in that forward. And again, I think there's a lot of trust between what we do and what the band members, want to find is being, projected in. And I mean, there's so many books about Led Zeppelin. Some are good, some aren't. But I think ours is out there as something that is done with such integrity and such detail and such accuracy. And again, you can't ask more than that.
Richard Cole, he is someone you don't hear much about. He's a pretty quiet, reserved guy, doesn't like to get into the spotlight.
Well, you got to remember now that they're all of an age, where their health isn't as great as it used to be. And I think he lives a very reserved life. He's had an incredible career. He didn't only manage Led Zeppelin, he managed bands afterwards, the Choir Boys and stuff like. But I know one thing he is, he's incredibly proud of what he achieved in the years with Led Zeppelin, and how groundbreaking they were, and how it went, as he would say, from a couple of Lincoln convertibles to their own plane. And that journey, he was on every step of the way. I mean, the forward in the book is such a scene setter. To get Richard was perfect. Possibly even beyond one of the band members, because he had a different view. He wasn't part of the he didn't do the performing, but he did things that enabled them night after night to do that. And his ability to get them from A to Z was crucial in terms of them as a live act, particularly in the early years where, they played, over 100 dates, in the first year, in fact, more than that. And again, it was him and Peter Grant pushing them to, the road crew in the early days was 6 people. Metallica have about 70 people for every gig, and you've got to remember what a close-knit team the Led Zeppelin thing was in the early years. It got a bit more expansive as the stages got bigger. But again, he, read that forward, because it sets the scene, and then the story begins to unfold. And they're in a gymnasium in, Scandinavia one minute, and they're playing 6 nights at Madison Square Garden the next. It's just a great, great story. And the platform we've had to tell it is such a fantastic one. But to be able to tell it what we did took an incredible amount of work. And again, between us, we pulled that off, which is fantastic.
And the book is dedicated to the memory of John Bonham. Were you fortunate enough to meet him?
Well, I was actually, yeah. Again, I was very lucky to be in the right place at the right time in 1980 when they toured. And I went over to see 5 of the final concerts as covering it for the TVL magazine, because they trusted that magazine. And I had some tremendous times with him, and very on the last gig that I saw, wasn't quite the final gig, it was Berlin. I saw the Munich gig, I had to come home, but we had a night in the hotel with them all, and he gave me a big bear hug, and he said, "Why don't you call me when we get back, and you'll have to come over to the house." This is ridiculous. I was 21. I was like, suddenly I'm talking to, my idols, as it were, almost on a friendship basis. And he wrote down, I've still got it, he wrote down his phone number, where we lived in Chronicl Green. And I rang him twice in the August, and he was very upbeat. They were going to America in the fall, and my plan was to go over. But obviously all of that came to, an abrupt end when he sadly died. So, yeah, his legacy, carries on. That the musicianship that he brought to Led Zeppelin, that, it does deserve, obviously, to be dedicated to him, because I think he was the heart and soul. We're talking in a week where Paul, obviously Charlie Watts has sadly died, and he was the heart of the Rolling Stones. And I think, John Bonham was very a very similar role. He was take him away and there was nothing, which is why they couldn't carry on. They just couldn't. It was a chemistry. All right, very graciously, Jason took over for the O2 and that worked brilliantly. And they had one last blast just to prove they could do it, and they still could. But their real legacy is those years between 68 and 80 when they turned the whole rock business upside down. They made some incredible records. And night after night, they did it. Some nights were good. Some nights were extraordinary. Some nights were under par. They weren't perfect. The thing about Led Zeppelin, it wasn't about perfection. It was about the ability to go out there and be tight but loose. That's the expression. Sometimes it was loose, sometimes it was tight. But overall, on any given night, they made an audience sit up and look, and they did that all the way through. So to be able to project that through the concert tickets, the text, the set list, it tells a story. And again, Mike, I can only say hats off to Mike. He gave me the spark. We ran with it, but without his spark, there wouldn't have been a book. And it's fantastic that we've got. And again, when I haven't had a good chance to look at it yet. But I know how good it is, and Mike, I know, has lived with every page of it in the last 18 months, and we just now want to get it out there and make people understand this is an incredible document. And if you got the first one, fine, you need the second because it's the complete story.
To do this interview, it was important to Mike, and I know you, Dave, as well, that I get a copy of this book because just like you say, you have to really look through these pages to get an idea of what this book is about. It has to be seen to be believed. Yeah, so let's get to some of the details in the book. Like the reviews of the shows, Zeppelin fans know very well they were not the critics' darlings in the early days, but the average fan may not be aware of this. But the first ever U.S. show, December 26th, 1968, at the Auditorium Arena in Denver, Colorado. They were the unbilled support act for Vanilla Fudge and Spirit. Thomas McCluskey of the Rocky Mountain News wrote, quote, singer Robert Plant, a cut above average in style, but no special appeal in sound. Guitarist Jimmy Page of Yardbirds fame, exceptionally fine. Bassist John Paul Jones, solid, involved, contributing. John Bonham, a very effective group drummer, but uninventive, unsubtle, and unclimactic in an uneventful solo. Now, Thomas looks somewhat silly reading that all these years later. Is there a particular negative review of the band from this book that really stands out?
There's a few that are like just brutal. One that comes to my mind right away is a 1970 Montreal review. It's from April of 1970. And the guy, I think his name was Juan Rodriguez. I mean, he ripped them literally to shreds. And you just have to say, there has to be something personal. A review just can't be that venomous without something personal behind it. But that wasn't the only one. It's funny because every time they went to Los Angeles, it was between two guys, Robert Hilburn and John Mendelsohn. John Mendelsohn was a guy who wrote Led Zeppelin's first review in Rolling Stone, and he just ripped them, just totally ripped them. And between John Mendelsohn and Robert Hilburn, for the next 8 years, they would go back and forth. And every other year, they would just slaughter the band in the reviews of the concerts. You can go through the concert evenings with Led Zeppelin, you'll see it. Every time they were in Los Angeles, the ironic thing is, if you listen to the bootleg tapes from their LA shows, the LA shows were among the best shows they ever did. It seemed like they didn't perform a bad show in Los Angeles. I mean, if you're a true fan and you understand the music, you realize they were at their peak performance. But for whatever reason, I think a part of it too, I think there may have been not only the resentment over their success, but I also think there may have been a little bit of the fact that whether it was the fact that the Beatles were so successful here, another English act comes over here and they're grabbing all the headlines and the success, I think that may have caused some resentment. And because Rolling Stone was notorious for slamming English bands, whether it was Led Zeppelin, whether it was The Who, whoever it was, Rolling Stones, they always seemed, Rolling Stone magazine was just, it didn't seem like they were very fair to the English acts. A part of it too is, not for anything, but Rolling Stone was from, it was based out of San Francisco, and you got that whole hippy dippy thing going on. It was more of the San Francisco type bands, the San Francisco jam bands that they were into than, hard rock and Led Zeppelin. But I also think there were probably some personal things behind it too as well. I don't know. When you read the reviews, it's more than just watching a concert and not enjoying a concert. These reviews are just vicious.
I mean, I know Rolling Stone reporters were young, but I wondered around the country, maybe you had some older reporters that would go out there and they were forced to go review the show, and I don't want to go to see this.
I do think
right?
that's a part of it.
Possible too.
Yeah, I think that maybe it was too loud for him. Who knows?
Sure. Some scary moments in Zeppelin's career on the road documented in the book too. There was an air scare following their TV appearance in March of 1969 in Germany. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, they were coming back from their Beat Club appearance in Germany.
That's right.
They did a Beat Club appearance, and then they were flying back to England for a gig. In fact, they were coming back to play at the Marquee. And I guess, it was a very bad flight. And they just managed to survive there. There's a big story about it in the newspaper. In fact, there's a picture of the band members with Richard Call and just saying how it was pretty hairy and they had to evacuate the plane, and the band members were helping evacuate other passengers and stuff. So, it sounds like a pretty harrowing deal there.
Yeah, Robert Plant was quoted in that. He was talking about his experience in there, and he was a little scared, like, this could be it.
Yeah, I think probably the most terrifying experience of their career probably was the 1971 Milan show, which was their only show in Italy. By all accounts, it was a complete disaster. They only played like 25 minutes because I guess, the government authorities started shooting tear gas into the audience. There was a riot. I mean, all the equipment got destroyed. The band barely got out of there alive. I mean, it really sounds like a complete and utter disaster. They never returned to Italy as a result. That sounds like that was just a total disaster.
And that's documented in the book?
Oh, yeah. There's plenty of material on that one in there, too, as well. And the one thing we wanted to provide with the concert, so it's a little bit of background as much as we possibly could on the concert. It's not just here's a set list, here's a review, or here's an ad. We always wanted to make sure we gave some perspective as to how a specific concert, what it meant to a specific tour, and any details behind that concert that's a little bit unique.
Another one was the June 77 Tampa, where they played for 50 minutes. And the rain was so bad, they had to come off, and they're like a 50,000 crowd to disperse. And there was no makeup date. I think the ticket said "come rain or shine," so they couldn't go back and do the date again. And there was a near riot, obviously, when they came off the stage. And those moments, I think, was when it was beginning to get a bit crazy. And I think the Zeppelin story obviously gets difficult as they get bigger. And they're playing to bigger audiences, and there's a lot of things happening. They get to Oakland, and there's a lot of backstage violence, and the story wasn't all sweetness and light. It just wasn't. And like anything, there was a lot of people trying to manipulate them in the best way they could. And again, the story, the last 5 years of Led Zeppelin was a very hard time. If you look how they breezed through the first 5 years. And I often say the band that came off stage at Earl's Court in May 1975 was never the same again, because Robert Plant had lots of tragedy. He had a car crash, a serious car crash. Very sadly, his 5-year-old son died. And everything about the last 5 years was a slog. The fact they still pulled off Nebworth, they still went to Europe and did those shows, they kept going. I think one of the mysteries of the whole thing is what would have happened had they had carried on, and that's a really difficult question because things were changing. The fabric of rock was changing. New players were coming in, the Rushes, the Eddie Van Halens. They had competition that they didn't have because I think rock fans were a bit fed up with hanging around. And with Led Zeppelin in the last 5 years, there was a lot of hanging around. But they still had it in them. They still had new places to go. I think in 1981, had they continued, I think they'd have gone to America. I think they'd have rejuvenated themselves and done similar in England. We're never going to know that. So the story ends very abruptly in Berlin because that's it. They can't do any more. So yeah, I think again the melodrama, the dramas that occurred is also in the book. So early on it's all they're on a crest of a wave, but then it gets much more difficult. And there's riots, and there's riots when they're selling the tickets. There's, kids in America were going a bit crazy for this band. There were no other band like it. There's no doubt about it. It got to a point they were so big. Whoever was number two was so far behind. It didn't really matter. They were an institution, and again, I think that becomes evident as you read the book towards the end. And again, that's all part of the story. So it's great that we've got that too.
With regard to just getting back for a second to the Tampa show, I mean, it's kind of surprising because I think if in Florida, if there's a flash flood, it ends in about 10 minutes and then it's sunny in another 5 minutes later. I mean, as it turned out, if they just waited it out a little while, everything would have been fine. But that didn't happen. Because that's Florida. I mean, as you know, anything about Florida, it'll rain like hell for like a half an hour, and then it'll be beautiful 5 minutes later. But it's funny because I actually saw the show after that Tampa disaster. And, to Dave's point about the last 5 years of Led Zeppelin, even, when you think about after 1975, even in the U.S., so for 76, 77, 78, 79, 80, they only came to America in 77. But when In Through the Outdoor came out, it was number one. It was huge over here. It put all the rest of their albums on the charts again. So they still had something to prove, and they were still doing it. So, to try to figure out, okay, what would it have been like if they continued? I'd like to believe that coming over here for that fall 1980 tour, I think they would have reclaimed the mantle relatively easily. And then it's just a question of where they go from there, because, to most fans, In Through the Outdoor, when you think about waiting 3 years for an album, for the people who were more hard rock inclined like Zeppelin, In Through the Outdoor wasn't as popular with your average Led Zeppelin fan as, Physical Graffiti or Presence or, so even some of the other earlier albums. But still, Zeppelin was still a force to be reckoned with. And I think if John Bonham had made it over here for that 80 tour, and I think they would have gone in. I think they had gone in the studio again and had done an album that all four of them felt a little bit more strongly about, and they were all back in the groove again. I think it would have been a different ballgame, but it doesn't matter because that's not what happened.
Yeah.
I think having their legacy, as it were, for 12 years, because when you think about it, the first day in the studio was September 25th, 1968. Exactly 12 years to the day John Bonham died. So from day one to the very last day was 12 years. And you think about everything they accomplished, their legacy is intact. You didn't have to live through, like, if they were just, fade away as just a once great band. Led Zeppelin's legacy is intact. It's strong. The people still love them. I think the bootlegs are a very important part of it, because it's one thing to love the albums, and we all love the studio albums, obviously. But the great thing about Led Zeppelin and all the bootlegs is, to me anyway, I could put on a bootleg. I don't know the lick that Jimmy Page is going to play next. Even from night to night on the same tour, it's different. It's exciting. Today's point earlier, it's tight but loose. Some nights he's nailing it. Other nights, not so much. But just the fact that they were willing to go for it separated them from the pack. Because I think so many bands, especially during their time period, they played it safe. They rehearsed the same show. If you went to 40 shows, you saw the exact same show all 40 nights. And that was not what Led Zeppelin was about, not even close.
No, they were in the spirit of the Grateful Dead. I remember satellite radio on the jam band station, they played Zeppelin. And that's when it really occurred to me. I thought to myself, you know what? They were, in a sense, a jam band. Because what a jam band does is mix the set list up, try things different, even try things differently in the moment on the stage in the middle of a song, which is what they did.
It's funny because if you listen to Dazed and Confused, not sad, right?
Sure.
I went to, very fortunately, I went to every night when they played, Earl's Court in 75. And I can honestly say that no one song over those 5 nights was the same on each night. I mean, particularly something like No Quarter, where John Paul Jones would insert a piano concerto one night, there'd be a jazz theme the next night. That's the true beauty of Led Zeppelin live, was that anything could happen, and often did. That there was no sense of repetition. And yeah, there was such a sense of improvisation. And again, the songs were, the structure of the songs were the starting point. They then built around it. And again, Mike's so right about the bootlegs. The legacy, Led Zeppelin is one of the biggest bootleg bands, and that's such a great thing because you can hear the development. You can go on many internet sites and on YouTube. It's so accessible now. It wasn't in our day. We had to buy a record, or it was the bootleg thing was a whole mystery. It was like a being in a secret society.
Oh, it was like Indiana Jones finding the lost ark. Yeah, well, it was that you go to a record store and you'd see something there that those days are gone. The Booked on Rock podcast will return after this. I want to ask you, Mike, about we're from Connecticut. So I loved looking at all of the photos, reading about the band's appearance at the Oakdale Music Theater, Wallingford, Connecticut, August 17th, 1969. This is on the weekend of Woodstock. They are famously among the bands not at Woodstock. Now, they were not at Woodstock because I think Peter Grant made that call.
That's correct.
He didn't want them to be among other bands, right? He wanted them to be the band.
It's very odd because it's really contradictory when you think about it, right? Because he said he just didn't want to be another band on the bill, but that's exactly what they were for the Atlanta International Pop Festival, the Seattle Pop Festival, the Midwest Rock Festival, the Texas International Pop Festival, and a few other festivals. So that one was kind of a confusing statement because they were just a quote another band on the bill. For whatever reason, I think a part of it, and I could be wrong, a part of one of the reasons why he didn't want to do it was because he knew they were filming it for posterity, and he wanted Zeppelin to have that mystery of not being so out there, I guess. Plus I think he knew they'd lose control in terms of quality. Peter Grant was very concerned with making sure that his band got across the right way. And if he agreed to do it, and he agreed to have them in the film, and then if he saw it and the sound wasn't right or the visuals weren't right, I don't know, for some reason, he just wanted to have veto power on that, and they didn't play. But another reason could have quite simply been he already had like 5 or 6 shows booked, or 3 or 4 shows booked up, and he didn't want to can them.
Okay.
He had a show in San Antonio, Texas. He had one in Asbury Park, New Jersey. He had one in Wallingford, Connecticut, and then he had 2 in Toronto. Now, the 2 in Toronto were the Monday of the day after Woodstock. I mean, that wasn't a scheduled day, but oddly enough, that was the day that Jimi Hendrix played as the final act of Woodstock. He played on August 18th, 1969, the Monday morning.
The Asbury Park one is well documented because anytime there's an article about bands that didn't go to Woodstock, when they mention Zeppelin, they say they were at Asbury Park in New Jersey. Never read about the Connecticut part. That was either buried or not mentioned at all in the article. So I have to admit, I had no idea they were in Connecticut on the weekend of Woodstock.
Yeah, it's funny, too, because they were with Joe Cocker on August 16th, which August 16th was the second day of Woodstock. August 16th, right after Joe Cocker did his gig with Led Zeppelin, he took a helicopter to Woodstock. And that was a big thing because Joe Cocker, that was his coming out party in the United States. I mean, Woodstock really shot him into the American consciousness in terms of being a performer, so that was really big for him. But it's funny because that Sunday night at Oakdale, August 17th, my cousin Angela actually went to that show because her dad wouldn't allow her to go to Woodstock. He said, there's no way you're going to Woodstock, but he let her go to see Led Zeppelin at the Oakdale.
Are those her photos?
No, they're not. I'd say about a year and a half, 2 years ago, I saw one of the photos on a Facebook site about Connecticut concerts. And I contacted the guy because I've been looking for Oakdale photos for probably 15 years at least. And I asked the guy, do you have any more? He's like, yeah, I got a bunch more. And he had a heck of a lot more. And I wanted to do a 2-page spread. That Oakdale show meant a lot to me. It's funny, just to add a little side note here, is my first concert ever, it was at the Oakdale Theater, and it was 4 weeks before that Led Zeppelin show. It was Tom Jones.
Oh, Tom Jones.
Yeah, and he's in. If you'll notice in the book, Tom Jones is in the advertisement.
Yeah.
In July 18th, I went to the Tom Jones show. If I'd only known, I was only, I was young. I was only 8 years old, so it would have been nice to see Led Zeppelin at the Oakdale. But I guess I had to settle for Tom Jones.
The Oakdale Music Theater now is this beautiful place. It's obviously it's modern day, but at that time it was a tent. It looked like a circus tent.
It essentially was. It really was a big, big tent. And, you probably see it. And that's one of the reasons why it's funny, because the picture for that, because it was extremely difficult tracking down a picture of the original Oakdale. And literally a month before the first printing, I finally was able to find one in like a 1958 Connecticut travelogue book that was online. And that was the first time I had ever seen one, and it was black and white. But for this edition, I ended up switching it to a color postcard that I was able to track down. But yeah, because as you know, it's nothing like it today. It's a completely different facility. But at the time, it was a glorified, it was a tent that they erected every year.
And only 9 minutes of that show is available.
Yeah, allegedly the remaining portion of the show is still being hoarded, and that's another thing too. Is there's still a lot of stuff in the vaults, whether it's in the official vaults or people hoarding stuff. Every once in a while, you see something come out. The last few years, there's this group of internet guys called the Dogs of Doom, they call themselves, and they've been able to track down some 8mm footage, and they've also were able to track down some bootleg recordings that they unearthed and they put out there for free on the internet, which is great. That's really a nice thing. One thing that came out recently in full this year was the first show of the 1975 tour, the soundboard from Bloomington, Minnesota, which is right near the Twin Cities of St. Paul and Minneapolis. And the thing about that is it's pretty cool, because you heard a soundboard version, the only soundboard version of the very rarely played When the Levee Breaks, and also the Wanton song. They played those songs early in the tour because Jimmy Page hurt his finger and they didn't play Dazed and Confused. So they worked in some other songs they didn't typically play into the set. How many more times? They didn't play it on that particular night, but they played it on other nights.
So guys, I want to ask you about Zeppelin's shows in terms of length, because with that experimentation that we talked about, they got up to about 3 hours for shows. Do you know what the longest Led Zeppelin concert is?
I would imagine Earl's Court was pretty long. Again, Mike can take over here. Seattle 75.
I think the Earl's Court shows were pretty long. They're like almost 4 hours practically. It was crazy how long they were. And also too, I think the LA 75 show, especially the last one, was a real marathon session as well. Between all those, they were pretty much pushing like 3 hours and like 45 minutes, somewhere around there.
Yeah, that long. Okay. Really long. Yeah, so they were Springsteen-esque.
Oh, yeah.
Well, I think, again, it's another Zeppelin trait that they rewrote many rule books, and one is about the length that they played, which is one of the reasons which we go back to the Evenings with Led Zeppelin slogan. Peter Grant realized that they didn't need support acts. They just didn't. It was an evening with Led Zeppelin, and it was going to be a lengthy evening. And again, to touch it on the LA shows, it got to a point where often you felt that they didn't want to come off stage because they were having such a great time, and I don't think it was planned. A Dazed and Confused in 75, it got up to 40 minutes, and No Quarter in 75 got up to a similar length. I think they took it as far as they could go. And again, when you get to 1980, where they did the Europe tour, where it scaled down, I think it peaked in 77, where you could say maybe it got too long, and the attention span of the audience sometimes wandered a little bit. I remember Brian Knapp, actually, who I think he saw the shows in Chicago, and he was saying that during No Quarter, people were up and walking around because it was a lengthy track. And I think that happened a bit. And again, obviously, the audiences were sometimes flowered by whatever substances might have been around at the time. So But in the end, I think they reached the pinnacle, and certainly the Earl's Court, which had a unique acoustic set, which America didn't get, and we were very lucky to see that. And then when they went to 77, there were certain sections of the set list which were played out and had durable time, and it could be 10 minutes, it could be 15, it could be 20. And then obviously John Bonham's drum solo, it probably did get a bit excessive. And I think when it got to 1980, where many things were changing, and particularly in England, where the punk thing was coming in, and the new wave, and the more immediate, the more immediacy of bands, I think declared that they had to come down a bit. And again, I was lucky enough to see some of those shows in 80, and they were slick, and the fact they started with Train Kept a Rolling, which was the number they used as a set list in 68, 69, was a rejuvenation. So in a way, it was great that they were able to come full circle. But when it was long, it was very long.
Well, Days of Confused was up to 30 minutes, right?
Yeah. Actually, in Seattle in 75, it literally exceeded 40 minutes. So it's a classic version, of course. But yeah, it exceeded 40 minutes. So they were a little out of control, especially on the 77 tour when you think about it. Between the Jimmy Page's guitar solo, a.k.a. the noise solo, as they call it, John Paul Jones's No Quarter, Moby Dick. Basically, you have 3 songs that take up, more than an hour. It's a lot. It's trying a lot of people's patience when, you have solos that last that long.
Did they shorten up Days of Confused in later years, Dave, when you said you saw them in that last tour?
Well, what they did is they dropped it, which was quite an unusual thing, because, again, Jimmy didn't have the platform to do his solo, or the violin solo, which had become such a part of the theatre of Led Zeppelin. But in Europe, I think there was a definite effort to cut it down. There was no Moby Dick. There was no Days of Confused. There was no Quarter, and it was sharper. And I think that's where they would have headed. I think it had to head that way, because obviously the punk thing had come in, and the dinosaur bands, as they were labelled, along with Pink Floyd and Yes and such like, there had to be that. And as I said before, when we were talking earlier, the new bands that were coming up, the Van Halens, they were sharper and they were on the ball. And I think, Led Zeppelin had to prove themselves that they could be a rock and roll band in a very tight ship, if you like. And I think that's where it would have headed in 80. I think particularly in the full tour of America, it may have been a 2 hours, but I don't think it would have been as excessive, anything like that it used to be. And that would have been a good thing, because I think the audiences were a bit done with that, And again, if you look at the Into the Outdoor album, it was sharper. And I think there was a general sense of the virtuosity was still there, but it didn't need to be declared in 3 hours plus. They could make a statement in 2 hours, and certainly in Europe, and there were some great shows in Europe. I think that was the pointer. And it says everything about how their ability to connect with their audience. And I think they realized that the audience wanted it to be a bit slimmer. And that was the great thing about it. And again, in the book, where you see the momentum, and then you see it turn a little bit towards, 1980. And again, the wonder of it all is, where would it have headed? And we're not ever going to know. But that won't stop people, theorizing about it. And that's the great thing about Led Zeppelin. You never stop searching for answers. And again, the book, I think, answers a lot of stuff, but also opens up, a lot of debate, which is great. And that's what goes on now.
Speaking of Van Halen, the influence that Led Zeppelin had on so many bands, Van Halen is included. Eddie was at one of those LA Forum shows, and after he watched Jimmy touching and tapping the string with his right hand, Eddie was inspired to play around himself with using his fingers on the fretboard and things like that.
Yeah, I mean, Mike, it might be a good point to tell the listen to this Eddie story.
Yeah, the Listen to This Eddie story was a concert on June 21st, 1977. It was at the LA Forum, and the legendary Mike Millard, who recorded a ton of shows in the LA area, and he had a very unique way of getting great seats and recording great shows. And the way he did it was he used his wheelchair. He didn't have a wheelchair. He used it as a prop to hide his recording equipment. And he would get seats literally in like the first 5 rows or whatever, plop right down in the center and record really great concerts that way. And in fact, that particular show, it was Listen to This, Eddie. That was a bootleg title. And that was in reference to, like, because evidently Eddie had some critical comments regarding Jimmy's concert performance after he saw the show. He was basically saying how Jimmy wasn't that good in concert. He didn't play very well, and so basically this whole bootleg was a retort to those comments. Listen to this, Eddie, because that particular show was a brilliant show, and it's really one of the most popular bootlegs, and it's an excellent show. All the band members were on fire, and Jimmy was doing his thing that night. So, but yeah, Mike Millard recorded a lot of Zeppelin shows and a lot of other shows, and that was his famous bootleg, Listen to This, Eddie.
Well, where Eddie's coming from is an analytical, technical standpoint. So he's looking at all things that the average fan is looking at, different types of players.
Fair criticism, I might add. See, Jimmy walked the edge. Jimmy rather go for it and really go for brilliance rather than so many other bands that you may as well just put on the record and leave. You know, Jimmy Page and even all the other members of the band as well, they challenged themselves every night. They didn't have a canned, rehearsed, not to be too critical of a band like the Eagles, because they do their thing and they do it really, really well. But the Eagles, if you go one night and you see the next night, you see the exact same show. And that was not Led Zeppelin at all. That certainly was not Jimmy Page at all. And the thing is, when it worked really well, it was absolutely brilliant. When it didn't work, it wasn't so brilliant. But the thing is, they made the effort to really push themselves to, make it unique, every show unique, rather than just, let's just rehearse a 2-hour show. Let's do the exact same thing. Every time I'll play the exact same lick. And, just by having so many bootlegs, because God knows so many of their concerts were recorded, you realize that was their approach, because you could take a song like, a great example is like Over the Hills and Far Away. You would think it would pretty much be the same, relatively every night. But every time he did that solo, he was taken off in a different direction. It was always within a particular framework. But Jimmy wanted to challenge the bandmates. He wanted to challenge himself. And for the most part, it worked really well.
I think one of his quotes in recent years has been, there was an ESP going on. There was literally something special in the chemistry of all 4 of them. And they might have had a few cues where they knew where they were going to go. But within those cues, anything could happen. I think Over the Hills is such a great example. I mean, in those LA shows in 75, 3 nights, that track is never the same. It's just not. And that, I think, attracted so many people to them. And again, we talk about the bootlegs. If ever a band were synonymous with bootlegs, then it's Led Zeppelin, because you had to capture the show to understand the improvisation that was going on. It was never the same. And I'm sure it must be so exciting to be a young fan picking up on Led Zeppelin, as we used to do all those years ago when those bootlegs came out. When I first heard Days of Confused, it was on the BBC Sessions. I taped that show on April the 4th, 1971. I'd only ever heard the albums. And when I heard Days of Confused like that, well, it opened up a whole new ballgame. I thought, this is only the starting point. And I'm sure young fans now, that's the beauty of Led Zeppelin, people who discover them, the studio albums are the starting point. When you get to the live albums, the official live albums, which are great, and then you get to the bootlegs, which, are very accessible now online. We used to have to pay good money for them, but, it's fantastic that music's out there. On YouTube now, you can go and look at any night Earl's Court and understand what was going on. And again, in the book, we're trying to reflect that momentum and the detail. And again, when you match the visuals of the book, and again, I've been, probably for the first time this week, I've had a real good look at this new edition. Because I just needed to sit down, and the breadth of work in it is astounding. And to say I'm proud of it, and again, hats off again to Mike, who was relentless in this pursuit of finding every detail of the story. Then, we've had some great, for the book is out in the UK now, and it follows in America at the end of the month. And we've had some amazing feedback already, and people understand what we're trying to do. It's not, for me, it's not just any rock book. It's a statement, and the statement is, this is what this band was about. And we're not talking about any band. We're talking about one of the most important bands of all time. So the fact we've been able to chronicle in the way we have, it is a wonderful thing. And yeah, we're incredibly proud of it.
Yeah, and I already talked about the Amazon reviews for the first edition, which were across the board 5 stars. I can just imagine once this one gets out there and the reviews start coming in for this, they're going to be amazing.
Well, I think Mike will, I'm sure, elaborate on, people have been, people come on and they say, well, what's different about the book? But the detail in it, when you start looking, over to you, Mike. I mean, you tell me the detail that went on in the last year.
Yeah, no, it's the amount of time that went into this book. I think if people really understood, they'd be shocked how much time and effort went into this book. And the key thing is, just to go back a little bit to what we were talking about regarding their concerts. The bootlegs are so important because, I love the studio albums like most people do. They're just legendary classic albums. But I don't think if they didn't have bootlegs that went along with the albums, there wouldn't be this book. Because the kind of passion, the fact that, you don't know, when you listen to a bootleg and you're listening to any song, and you're going through it, you don't know what's going to come up next. You don't remember every single bootleg and the lick that's going to come up next, and you literally could wait for 20 seconds and you just hear a little 20 seconds of brilliance on any given night, or wherever it is. But the thing is, with this book, it's always been a question of every concert was considered a historic event in our eyes, and that's how I think a lot of people feel the same way we do. And people like Andy Adams, they take a lot of they just get a lot of enjoyment out of the band, and they listen to the music, they listen to the bootlegs, but they want to know more about each specific concert and what it meant as an event. So whether it's looking at the venue picks, whether it's looking at the concert reviews, whether just seeing, okay, what's the different set list twist, or all the concert posters, the tickets, you name it. But the thing is, if you look at every single entry, and you'll see, that it is a part of rock history. And the key thing for us too is really trying to find as much new material as we possibly could, because that's really the challenge. And fortunately, as more archives continue to come online, you'll see additional entries into the concert history. For example, this time around, we were able to find, another 11 or so concerts that they were scheduled, but they were canceled. But, it still adds to the history, even though they weren't played, they were advertised, they were slated to be performed. And it all just, for people like Dave and myself, who really, we really enjoy the whole Led Zeppelin concert history.
That's where I want to get to the canceled shows, because I think that's fascinating. But before we do that, Mike, you mentioned Andy Adams. Sadly, he just recently passed away. Andy was a freelance music journalist, author, and a huge Zeppelin fan, well known among the Zeppelin community as one of the biggest Led Zeppelin archivists. I know you guys wanted to just say something brief on Andy, on his passing.
Well, I'm going to let Dave take that first, because he was very close.
Yeah, I met Andy in the mid-'80s, and well, as I said earlier, I thought I knew a lot about Led Zeppelin, but Andy's was forensic, and his passion was great, and he shared it. We did the first UK convention together, and we brought people together. Andy was a communicator of people, even above Led Zeppelin. He liked a lot of other bands, Blue Oyster Cult and many others, and he brought the same passion. He shared this passion so brilliantly, and he was so generous. He was a kind, thoughtful guy. I've met many people in the Zepp world, but there was only one Andy Adams, and you knew what you were going to get. And to be in his company was a joy. It just was. And I had many joyous moments with him. And it's a testament that his Celebration Days Facebook page had 22,000 on it. And he'd been doing this a long time, and his passion never dulled. I mean, even in the last week of his life, he got the evenings with Book, and it's a wonderful thing that he got enjoyment from that in those final days, and spoke to Mike. Was one of the last people to speak to him. So I cannot overstate his influence. There's very few people that are on his wavelength. They're just not in the Zep thing. And he was a massive collector. He was a massive chronicler. He was a massive sharer. He had his own fanzine. He run the conventions, and he went on to do many more conventions. One day, one's in London. And he was a bringer together of Led Zeppelin fans. That's what he was, and he was good at that. And he was good at sharing it. And that platform, the various platforms he used for that, be it Facebook or fanzines or whatever, were all of the highest level, and the highest quality, because Andy didn't get facts wrong. He just didn't. If you saw something by Andy, you knew the accuracy was going to be right there. And, it was just a joy to be with him, and he had a good attitude with it. He wasn't pretentious about it. He wasn't, I've got this and you haven't. He shared everything. And again, to say, my first real, statement in publishing was Led Zeppelin: A Celebration, which I did in 1990. It was the first real book. I had a couple of other things before that, and I knew I needed Andy, and he opened his archive. I went to his house a few times, and we shared great moments. And again, even in the last few years, where nowadays when we have phone calls with any of our Led Zepp followers, it's not about the latest bootleg. It's how's your health, because we're all getting we're getting into a later stage of our life. I was 65 last week, and it seems like only seconds ago I was caught. But we're all getting older, and again, poor Andy hasn't lasted the course at 60, and that's sad. But he packed it in, he shared it. So what Andy did, he shared this thing, and he did it in a most glorious way, and he won't be forgotten. I think really the real, testament to his legacy, and it was a legacy, is what Mike will tell you now. In the last phone call, I think one of the last that he had a couple of weeks ago was with Mike. And Mike, you tell me about his passion on that night, on that day.
Yeah, it was literally a week to the day that we found out about Andy's passing. And Andy and I met Andy 3 years ago when I went over to London for the release of the first book. I mean, we had communicated before then, but it was great to finally meet him. We made a great connection, and literally the last few years, Andy and I exchanged, dozens of emails, back and forth. And then, the Saturday, a few Saturdays ago, I got a message from him, "Hey, Mike, you want to do a video conference?" I'm like, "Yeah, sure, let's do it." We spoke for almost 2 hours, and I know he had health issues, but he was in really good spirits. He had a lot of things going on in mind. He was always planning something in terms of music, because, I mean, really, you will never meet too many people that know more about music than Andy Adams. I mean, he knew, he knows 10 times more about music than I'll ever know. I'll be the first to admit that. The thing is, it's funny because a lot of our discussions, especially, just going back and forth via Messenger or whatever, a lot of it was not Zeppelin related, just some of the other, music acts we connected on. I know he was a big Rush fan too, but Andy saw an insane amount of concerts. I mean, literally, like I can't even put a figure on it, but I know it's well over 1,000. I know that for a fact. He was just like Dave. I think the key thing with Dave, Dave's reputation in the Zep community is very well established because he brings people together. Zep fans across the world, all his works, everything that's been documented for the last 45, 50 years now, Dave did a lot of bringing people together, and that's what Andy did as well. He brought people together, and that's why his Facebook page went from it seemed like about 100 subscribers to 22,000. It seemed very quickly, because he always had a lot to add to it every night, and he was a passionate guy, and it was a real shock when he passed, and it's very sad, but he has a strong legacy, and like to Dave's point, Andy won't be forgotten. That's for sure.
The Booked on Rock podcast will return after this. You chronicle the canceled Zeppelin shows, which is just fascinating. I think sometimes as fascinating as the shows that went on. An interesting clipping on page 598. John Bonham passed away on September 25th of 1980. They had two shows previously scheduled for Richfield Coliseum in Richfield, Ohio on October 26th and 27th. Shortly after Bonzo's death, the local Ridgefield paper posted a blurb, which you have in the book. The headline reads, Led Zeppelin may cancel. The Led Zeppelin October 26th and 27th appearance at the Coliseum has not been formally canceled yet, the English group's label Swan Song Records reported yesterday. The 20-date tour has been in doubt since the death Wednesday of drummer John Bonham at the Thames Valley home of Zeppelin guitarist Jimmy Page. I had assumed that the press was informed right away that the tour was canceled and Zeppelin was done. These days it would have been posted on social media right away, but back then news traveled slowly. Or was it that the band was so devastated that they just hadn't made an official statement?
They did not make an official statement at that point in time, but there was no way they were ever going to play without John Bonham. I refuse to believe that they would ever have gone forward with the show.
Well, that period between the September and when they officially announced it, December the 4th, there was a lot of speculation in the press. There were drummers' names mentioned, Carmine, PC, Paul Thompson, Roxy Music, Carl Palmer, all the usual names came up. I don't think it was ever on, but I think they had a period well, in the end, what happened was they went to Jersey. They decided, they went away, and then they came back and they had a meeting at the Savoy Hotel. Now, I was a frequent visitor to the record company Swan Song in London in King's Road. And I went in the late November, and it was a very weird atmosphere. And there was a lot of the roadies were in. People like Benji Lefebvre who did the sound and Mick Hinton did the drums. And they'd all been called in because they knew that their jobs were now going to rescind. I think they were all paid off quite handsomely. But there was that atmosphere of that day, and I remember that day really well, was that, well, it's definitely not going to carry on. It can't, and no one was telling me that. And I didn't stay that long or outstay my welcome. I was just someone who was doing the magazine and trying to, do his bit. I wasn't trying to, find out anything but it was evident it wasn't going to happen. So I think when the statement was made, nobody was too surprised. What I can tell you about that statement is it came in the same week that John Lennon was shot. And that buried that news, really. And it's incredible how the John Lennon assassination dominated the next few months. And Led Zeppelin's legacy wasn't really given the time to be, acknowledged, because there was much bigger news with the John Lennon thing. And that's why in the early 80s, they went through a period of unfashionability, and they just did. It only came back probably after Live Aid, really, but we all know now that, that seems an absurd position. But when that announcement was made, it was buried a little bit because there was bigger news. Christ, was there ever? A very weird period, but there wasn't a chance of them continuing. It wasn't going to be like The Who with Kenny Jones coming in, another drummer in Led Zeppelin at that time, inconceivable. And they did the right thing. It's the only thing they could have done. Yes, there's been obviously Jason Bonham at the O2 and one or two of the other things they did, mainly the O2. That was fitting. Jason had I think, grown up and his position that night, was absolutely right. But at the time of 1980, it couldn't go on. And it was, I think, part of the legacy of Led Zeppelin is that, and again, in the book, Mike and I really decided that this platform of information was from 1968 to 1980. Anything else, Page and Plant, solo, whatever, is on the sort of, the extra sort of peripheral. Led Zeppelin's story is those 12 years, and that's what the book represents more than anything else, because that's the core of what their history was. And it's fantastic that I think we didn't get bogged down with anything else. Yeah, we touch on the reunions, but it literally starts on September the 7th and ends on July the 7th, 1980. I should know that. And that's the body of work that we're trying to encompass in the book, and what a story it is, as you know, we've been able to tell it.
Do you have a personal pick, each of you, as the concert?
Some of the September 71 shows are the highlights for me. I mean, 50 years ago this month, in fact. But, you know, I know that the Osaka 71 show, September 29th, 1971, that's a very, very much a favorite, especially because they played some songs they don't typically play. They played some surprise songs in the Whole Lot of Love medleys. But, for example, that night they played Friends, you know, from the third album, which, you know, they only played that one time. And it was just a very, you know, to rip off Dave's fanzine title, very much a tight but loose concert. And Zeppelin always were willing to try a little bit more before the Japan audience than they would in the U.S. or even in England. So, but those Japan 71 shows are terrific. It started in Tokyo on the 23rd and 4th. Then, you know, they went over and they ended up playing in Hiroshima on the 27th, and then the 28th and 29th in Osaka. But yeah, those are probably my favorite Zepp shows. Although, you know, the 71 shows are really, really good. I also like the 69 shows a lot. And of course, I always listen to the show I attended to, which, you know, just brings back a lot of great memories.
That's a very difficult question. I would look to the Bluebell Hill bootleg, September 4, 1970, which was the first bootleg that I really heard. The Earls Court shows, which again I think were a real pinnacle. They were top of their game. It was never the same after that. Yeah, and I was lucky enough to be at all 5 of those. Yeah, 71. I mean, they were just doing it in their sleep. You know, they didn't even think about it. 72, the US tour. That's a bit of a low-key tour. They were at the same time as the Rolling Stones, and the press wasn't anything like they'd previously had. You know, the LA shows there are great. And even in the latter part, you know, I have great affection for Nebworth because, you know, they had a lot to lose that night. That August the 4th show, they hadn't played anywhere for 2 years, apart from a couple of warm-ups, you know, in Denmark. And, you know, the thing with Zeppelin is they climbed a lot of mountains and they had a lot of setbacks, particularly in the last 5 years. And every time they climbed a mountain, you know, it was such a moment. And there, again, in the book, you can, as I say, I keep going back to this, you know, momentum. You know, and when you read the momentum from a gymnasium in 68, you know, to Nebworth in 79, it's such a great story. And I think it's unparalleled. I just think it is in live, you know, performance. I don't think there's any band that has had that momentum and that spark. And again, what we said again is about the book tells a history of rock history as well. You know, from acts playing, you know, in the Fillmore, and then Zepp taking it further and playing a one-act thing in Tampa Stadium. It's the development of rock history, the rock promotion game. And again, I think in the intro of the book, we list how many acts they supported or worked with, and it's just like a real history of American music in 69 and 70, particularly when they did have support acts. Everyone from Janis Joplin, Crosby, Stills and Nash, you know, the James Gang, so many. It's such a great period. And then you look at bands that were swinging by at the same time, Tom Jones, you know, and they were in the middle of all of that. And, you know, and they played in tents and Pirates World, and what a great story, you know. And then when you get to the bigger gigs, and as I say, you know, at Nebworth, when, again, I was lucky enough to be there, they had a lot to lose that night, and they didn't lose it. They still had it. And again, reading the book, I think anyone who looks through the whole story will understand that, you know, they never lost it. There were no number 2 concerts. There were only number 1.
The Booked on Rock podcast will return after this. I want to ask about the set list. The most played song by the band, I believe, is Dazed and Confused. Whole Lot of Love behind that. Quite a few popular Zeppelin songs rarely played, like Ramble On, Your Time Is Gonna Come, Good Times, Bad Times, but there are close to 20 songs that they never played. Is there one that really surprises you that they never played, or one that you're disappointed that they never did? Living, Loving, Made, Jamaica are a couple that come to mind for me.
Yeah, no, there were like one of the songs that I wish they had played in full, just because it's one of my personal favorites. I wish they played the Rover. I just always
Yeah,
loved
I
that
go with that.
song,
Yeah.
and it just had a great Jimmy Page vibe to it, and they played like the opening riff to it, like leading into Sick Again, but they didn't really play that one. I'm kind of surprised, but there were quite a few. I'll give you another example too. In the '77 tour, because for all intents and purposes, that was the Presence tour. I mean, it was a year after Presence, but I'm surprised they didn't replace Since I've Been Loving You with T for One, only because it just seemed like a natural to do that, because it's your blues standard and just a little bit different. I mean, I love Since I've Been Loving You, but it would have been nice to hear something a little bit different than that. But there were probably between Dave and myself, we could probably come up with probably 20 tracks that we wish they had played in concert that they didn't.
The Rover was Van Halen, by the way, played the Rover in their club days. That was one song they played.
I remember hearing that.
Yeah.
That was a pretty good version too, I might add.
Again, going back to the bootlegs, there's a tremendous tape, which we had a job actually pinning down when it was, but where they rehearsed Night Flight, which they never played live. They do the One Song, which wasn't often played. So, there's always those little teasers they would put in, but they never quite go with it. And I mean, something like Candy Store Rock, the basis of that, you can hear a little bit in Over the Hills, Earl's Court. Again, there were little, pointers that they often put in. There's a bit of T for one, certainly T for one is, there's bits of it, there's bits of Walter's Walk in various things. But I think when it's interesting again and again, it says everything about Led Zeppelin never conformed to a rule book. But they have an album, and they tour the album, and they only do 2 songs from the album. They could have done Candy Store Rock. There's lots they could have done, and it's mildly frustrating when you look back. But I guess there were reasons. There's always a reason. It's always gospel according to Jimmy, and he would have had some reason for not doing it. But again, to bring it full circle, one of the greatest numbers on the night of nights at the O2 on the night of the reunion was For Your Life, which they'd never played live. So it was said everything about Led Zeppelin that they could bring something out that they'd never played live and make it one of the highlights of the evening. That was the surprise element that was always in there. But yeah, there were some missed opportunities, but that's all part of the story, I think.
All of those songs you name, I love all of those songs, the deep tracks, the ones that weren't on the radio. I would have loved to have been able to see them in person, or would love to be able to just watch them perform them on YouTube. But a lot of times it may be that the members or one of the members just didn't like the song after it was done, or they're rehearsing it, they try it and just not feeling it. Let's skip it. Yeah. Or it's a little too hard on Robert's voice.
I think like a good example of what you're talking about perhaps is they only played Custard Pie one time live. And while I was researching this book and digging deep, I noticed that Custard Pie was in a few different reviews for their basically their 1975 warm-up show in Rotterdam, Holland. And they played Custard Pie, but that's one of the few nights of the 75 tour where there's not a bootleg. So we don't even hear what it sounds like live because it hasn't been released. And that's one they actually rehearsed the following week in Bloomington, Minnesota, according to Neil Preston, who took a lot of photographs at their 75 opening night rehearsal. But for whatever reason, maybe they just didn't like the way it sounded or it came out and they dropped it.
Are there songs Robert played more often in his solo career than with Zeppelin?
Well, yeah, I mean, Ramble On springs to mind. Led Zeppelin never did a full version of that. But when he started to talk, do the Zepp songs in, 1988, 1990, Ramble On came in and was very much played. And in Page and Plant, when they went on tour in 95, that was a central part of the show. And I think they did things like Friends, which wasn't often played. So, they were able to go back in the Page and Plant era and maybe revisit songs that, they wouldn't have done.
Hey, what can I do is another example.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, again, a lost B-side. And again, as they called it at the time, the evolution of Led Zeppelin, Page and Plant was a great thing for all of us to go back and have accessibility to seeing them play live again. It was short-lived in the end. It was 2 tours and that was it. But it was great fun, and they were very, I think, respectful to the legacy, and it worked perfectly. And again, it says a lot about the integrity, of Jimmy and Robert, and certainly John Paul Jones and John Bonham as well. So, but again, reading when you go through the book, and I'm sure hardcore fans will know to look for the points where maybe did they play that? Was there a bit of that? Australia, was there a bit of Rover? There was, and it's all chronicled. Nothing's missed. And again, that's even the mystery of Led Zeppelin, of which there's a lot of mystery, we try and demystify as much as we can. And again, that's part of the beauty of the book.
Well, just a couple more questions for you guys before I let you go. One of them has to do with, you mentioned Page and Plant and their reunion in the mid-90s. What are your thoughts on their post-Zeppelin careers?
I think they forged their own paths. Robert Plant has done his own thing. He's like a chameleon. He keeps changing and evolving. And I respect the fact that he does whatever he wants to do. And there's some things I've liked from his solo career. There's other things I haven't really liked particularly that much. But I respect the fact that he keeps on doing what he wants to be doing. He's a troubadour. He really, he loves music. He wants to keep progressing. And I really respect that, regardless of whether it connects with me or not. In terms of Jimmy Page, whether it was, doing the his soundtrack stuff, or whether it was The Firm or Page and Plant, obviously covered Al Page. He also did solo albums. He did what he wanted to do. And I really respect that. I'm in John Paul Jones, what more can you say? The guy has done so many different types of things, from producing to, you never know where he's going to turn up. The only thing you know is wherever he turns up, he makes it better. I mean, the guy's, in terms of musicianship, he's second to none. The guy's a brilliant guy. But all in all, I like the fact that they didn't try to just milk the Led Zeppelin legacy for 40 years after the death of John Bonham. They did their own thing, and like I said, some things were hit or miss with me, but I didn't want them to just be a legacy act and just beat it to death for 40 years. And that's one of the reasons why I think there's such a passion for the original band that we covered in this book from 68 to 80. The fact that their legacy has not been tainted. I don't think it's been tainted at all. In fact, it's been enhanced. But they forged their own paths, and I know, I'm sure all of them are really tired of the reunion talk all the time, especially, obviously Robert Plant is heavily annoyed by that because he's doing his own thing, whether it's with Alison Krauss or whether he's doing his solo projects with the Strange Sensation or whatever it is. But they have so much to be proud of, and the music that they put together through the years it's special.
Yeah, I think overall, they're musicians. They're always going to be musicians. So 12 years of their life was Led Zeppelin, but they've had a lot of years outside of that. And again, that's been the beauty of watching them grow. And I think Jimmy, he always wanted to be in Led Zeppelin, and he probably still does today. The fact that he couldn't be, I think he struggled with that at times, but he still produced some amazing stuff. And he's Jimmy Page. He just is. Robert has been incredible. As Mike said, he's been a troubadour. He's a chameleon. He searches and has come up with amazing stuff. John Paul Jones, again, as Mike has said, what a musician. I think their legacy inside Led Zeppelin is intact for whatever they do. And the fact they haven't spoilt it in any shape or form in Page and Plant, in whatever they've done, they're respectful to it. I mean, they know that they're going to be asked about Led Zeppelin before anything else in any interview. They just are. But I think they're understanding of that. But they've been tremendous musicians and have certainly kept my passion and my interest up. I always want to know what those guys are doing. I've never forgotten and never would do, because I know it's always going to be interesting. Again, like Mike said, some sticks, some doesn't. And yes, their main legacy is inside Led Zeppelin, but out of it, they're such amazingly talented musicians. And that's why Led Zeppelin was so good, because that chemistry was at its best inside that work. But they're just so interesting. they're musicians, and it's the word really. And again, to mirror what they did live in the book only emphasises that. But I need to know what they're doing next, because I know more often than not it will be worth listening to, and that's the way it is.
We got to give some love to Jason too, because he's kept the legacy alive. His Zeppelin
Yeah,
tours are great. He could play.
I think you've seen the Led Zeppelin Experience, Mike. Is that right? Have you seen the Led Zeppelin Experience?
I've seen that. Yeah. No, he's a tremendous drummer. He proved it. Just think, has there ever been a concert in the history of the world where there was more pressure on a single drummer for one night than the O2 concert? Every single drummer in the world is like, will you do it? Will you be able to pull it off? And he did in spades. He did.
He did.
He made his dad proud. He made Zeppelin fans proud. He made the band members proud. He did an awesome job that night.
Yep. And last question would be, did you guys get to see any of these post-Zeppelin shows, like the 1985 Live Aid or the 88 Atlantic Records concert, or even the 07 concert at O2?
I'll let Dave take that one first, because God knows he's seen them about a zillion times.
I didn't. There. I mean, I would love to be all of those. I mean, watching the TV coverage of Live Aid unfold was like watching the legacy come back, because it had been a bit tainted. The 88 was a mishap, but again, it was so typically Led Zeppelin. They didn't always get it right. Look through the book; they didn't always get it right, but it did come right. December the 10th, 2007, I was very lucky to be there. And I know how lucky I was. It was a lot of pressure actually going through it. And sometimes, often so when I saw the film, the Celebration Day film, which everyone saw, I probably enjoyed that a little bit more, because it was such a pressure evening, wanted it to be good. And it was good. It was a bit of a blur, really. It was like the guys that play in a major cup final, or you go through it, and I came out of it thinking, did that happen? And then for it not to happen again, which it didn't, despite all the speculation. And the one thing I remember about that night, amongst many things, is the set list was so beautifully paced. Stairway to Heaven was quite early, respectful. And I was watching it, and I was thinking, there's a number they've not done, and I can't think what it is. And it was Kashmir. And when they did Kashmir, and that performance of Kashmir, go and watch it on YouTube. They took it higher than it's ever been taken, and to be able to do that again, and I think it needed Robert Plant to be in the zone for one night only. He wanted to be Robert Plant rock god, and he really was. Jimmy was always going to be the man, and John Paul Jones was obviously always there and always the part of it, and Jason was great. So it's great that they had that one final burst that said, this is what we did, this is why we were the best, we still can be, but we'll leave it. And they left it. And so what's left? Well, Evenings with Led Zeppelin will tell you what's left, because it will never go away, because their legacy is entirely intact. And in those years, which we chronicled, it just goes to show what a band they were. And it's an unparalleled story. And again, we're just so proud to have told it and been given the second chance to make a good thing even better, which I think we've done.
Evenings with Led Zeppelin, the complete Chronicle, the revised and expanded edition, is out September 23rd through Omnibus Press. It's available wherever books are sold, but any specific sites you want to direct people to get a copy?
I think
I have got some copies for the UK on the Time of Loose website, but it's readily available on US Amazon and UK Amazon. We just want as many people to buy it as possibly can, and I'm sure those funnels and those outlets will supply it readily. But get it while you can, because when it's gone, it's gone. And it's a book that I think needs to be read by every Led Zeppelin fan. Simple as.
Dave and I go back a long time on a lot of various book projects, and in the Type It Loose magazine, and more than anything, this book is, it's for fans just like us. That's really what it's all about. We want to have people who are as passionate as we are about Led Zeppelin, in particular about Led Zeppelin concerts. There's so many people out there. We see it on the websites. We see it on, whether it's Type It Loose. We have, so many Facebook groups. You have Royal Orleans. You have Led Zeppelin. You have all these various sites, and the passion's still alive. It really is. A lot of people out there love it as much as we do. And the thing is, as far as I'm concerned, this book is for everybody. This is all the fans that love Zeppelin as much as we do. We want them to enjoy this book, and that's really what it's all about. It's a book for all of us.
Guys, I can't thank you enough for taking the time to do this.
It's been a pleasure.
This was a pleasure for me as well, just to be able to talk to you guys and talk about Zeppelin, because the legacy will go on. Books like this will only further that legacy.
Thank you very much.
Thanks to Dave Lewis and Mike Tremaglio for taking us through their book, Evenings with Led Zeppelin, The Complete Concert Chronicle, the revised and expanded edition. A big thanks to David Stock at Omnibus Press for hooking me up with a copy of the book and getting me in touch with Dave and Mike. Be sure to subscribe to Booked on Rock at Spreaker or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. You can find us online at bookedonrock.com. On Facebook at facebook.com/bookedonrockpodcast. On Twitter at bookedonrock. The email address is thebookedonrockpodcast@gmail.com. You can also contact me through the website. If you're an author of a book on rock and you want to be on the podcast, just send me an email. I'm Eric Senich. Look forward to having you back again next time for another brand new episode of Booked on Rock.